Welcome back to yet another lesson in the Python short course. Today in lesson 2, the focus is going to be Python variables. And much like many other programming languages out there, variables are a very important concept. For today's lesson, we have the following objectives in mind. First, we'll define Python variables briefly. Next, we'll move on to exploring the various data types available to us in Python, especially the primitive data types. And lastly, we'll wrap things up with yet another practical demonstration where we'll use variables. Now, first things first, what exactly are Python variables? Well, for the most part, variables are considered to be objects. Like everything else in object-oriented programming, every single thing that we use is classified as an object. Variables are no different. We use variables in the event that we would like to store data values inside of an empty box, if you will. This is one other way to think of variables. Sometimes you have an empty box and sometimes you simply want to put data or data items or information inside of a box so that at a later stage you can perform some sort of computation. Variables make use of reserved memory allocation. And again, this is so that we can perform some sort of computation in future after we've reserved memory for a specific piece of data. Now, when working with variables in Python, we tend to assign some sort of value. In this example, you'll notice that we have a variable called name, and we've assigned a value of Jack to this specific variable of name. Now, it's quite important to be cognizant of the fact that there are several primitive data types in Python, and we can essentially assign these data types to any given variable that we create. Note that we have strings, which is just a bunch of characters, including letters, numbers, and non-numerics. Floating points, which are numbers with decimal points included. And lastly, integers. These are all considered as whole numbers. Now, given that we've just explored the three primitive data types, let's have a look at a couple of examples. In the first instance, we have a string where the variable name is name. The value assigned is Jack. Why? Because this is non-integer and non-floating point. This is essentially a bunch of various characters, and we consider this a string. Next, we have floating points. And here we have a variable called meters, where the assignment value is 10.5. Excellent. Lastly, we have an integer where the variable name is age and we've assigned a value of 22. Notice that this is a whole number. Wonderful. Now that we've made a bit of sense of variables in Python, I think it's time for our practical demonstration. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So in order to get started with this practical, I've booted up my PyCharm environment. Notice that after booting up the environment, I've been redirected to our previous project. I'll simply click on File, Close Project, and this is going to close my project. So I'll create a new project instance, and I'll find that exact folder where we created the previous project, and I'll simply add a new folder called Lesson 2. Great. So let's make sure we are targeting this folder. And now I can simply click create. This is going to take a couple of seconds and my environment should be set up. Now we know from a previous lesson that we really don't need all of this boilerplate code. I'm going to go ahead and start to erase all of this. I'll save this now. And I want to make sure that I'm within my main.py script. Remember, this is the script that we are going to run going forward for our practical demonstration. Excellent. So let's start off by creating a very simple variable. And in fact, I'll use the example we had earlier. So I'll have name, but instead of Jack, I'll have Steve. So in order for us to actually show this in our output console, we need to go ahead and print the name variable out. Because as it stands, all we've done was we've assigned a variable to the name over here, or to the variable called name over here. This does not mean that this is actually going to run and display anything. And we can actually prove this by clicking on the run button over here. You'll notice that in my console, I have no output, which is not necessarily what we want. What we want is to actually see the name Steve being printed out. To make this a little more visible, I'll actually just head over to View and I'll increase the font size until it is somewhat more visible to you. There we go. That should be a lot better. So what I can do is I can simply write the word print over here. You'll see autocomplete, and I'll pass in the variable name that we just created. In essence, the print function in Python is what allows us to display the output inside of our console. This is something we also find frequently in other programming languages. However, this might be called different names. For example, in JavaScript, this might be called console.log. But you can think of this as a function, a built-in function of Python that allows us to output some data into our console so we can actually test and make sure that our script is working fine. So if I run this now, you'll notice I get the name Steve. What if I wanted to concatenate this with something else? Concatenation in programming essentially refers to combining two strings together. Let me show you how this works. So I'll take the name Steve as we have it over here, and I'll simply delete what we have inside of our print function, and I'll say hi in quotation marks because we are working with a string. That's the other thing that you have to note. When working with strings, we want to wrap them in quotation marks. And then I'll add a bit of spacing, and then I'll use the plus sign, and then I'll add name back in. So now if we print this, what we should see is hi Steve. And there we go. So what exactly is happening over here? All we've done was we've created a string inside of the print function, and we've concatenated it using the plus sign with the name variable, which is equal to Steve. Therefore, we print and see hi Steve. Now, the awesome thing about variables in Python is that you can actually update them. They are not static. Let me show you what I mean. If I change this to Jack and I run the script again, you'll notice I now see hi Jack. In fact, if I maintained Steve as is and I called the name variable again and I updated it over here to Jack, what we should see in essence is Jack and not Steve. So let's run this again, and you'll see I have Jack and not Steve. Even though we have a variable with the name of name set equal to Steve, we've overwritten the previous value from Steve to Jack, which is now the latest updated value of this variable. Excellent. So let's remove all of this for the time being, and let's work with a different data type. Let's work with the number data type. So I'll create a number over here called num1, which is equal to 5. On a new line, I'll create a number equal to 2. Or let's actually change this num2 equal to 10. And let's make sure that we get the valid outputs. So I'll simply print one of these. I'll print num2. And I'll run my code, and you'll see 10 is the outputted value. So I can create a third variable over here called result, and I can set this equal to num1 plus num2. And in my print statement, I'll simply change this to print the result. And what we can expect to see over here is the result of the variable we created here, and that is num1 plus num2. Let's verify this. And there we go. 15 is indeed what we are looking for. So what if we wanted to check the data types? How exactly could we go about doing this? Well, there's a simple function that we could use over here. So I'll just cut all of this out for the time being, and I'll simply say name is equal to Jack, and I'll have num1, which is equal to, let's say, 5 again. And now I'll simply print, and inside of the print function, I'm going to call an additional function over here. So I'll say print type, open up my parentheses. Because this is a function, I'm passing in a parameter. Parameters are something we'll discuss at a later stage. And I'll simply pass the name over here. And if we run this, we can actually see the class or the data type over here is of string type for name, which is the variable we created over here. If I change this to num1 and I ran this, I should see integer. And this is essentially how we can verify our data types. But let's try something interesting. Let's try to actually concatenate the string Jack with the number 5. So I'll remove this and I'll simply say name plus num1. Let's run this. And now I get an error simply stating that the two data types are not compatible. However, there is a trick and there is a workaround here if we wanted the output result to be a string. Because remember, you can't add a string and a number and get a number at the end of the day. However, you can add a string and a number and have that evaluate to a string. But then you lose all the numeric functionality. Let me show you what I mean. So I'll delete everything here and I'll simply say print the name plus str for string. And this is also a function. And what we'll do here is we'll convert a number to a string. That's essentially what this function does. And I'll convert num1 to a string and we'll concatenate that with name. So this now effectively becomes a string. It's no longer a number. And if we run the code, we see Jack 5. And that is basically it for working with very, very basic variables in Python. So in this lesson, we've defined what exactly variables are. We've had a look at some of the primitive data types that we can work with in Python. And we've also used a bit of functionality in terms of manipulating our data so that we can have some sort of output. And just to make sure that this actually works in our cloud programming software, we can actually test our code out. So what I'll do is I'll grab all of this over here. I'll bring in our cloud solution or our cloud IDE. I'll paste this code in. I'll run this and I get the exact same result. And that is it for today's lesson. In our next lesson, we're going to be working with Python operators. So for all of that and more, I'll see you in the next lesson. Cheers.